Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike O'Malley here with the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for May 17th, 2022, recorded on 4:10 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a lot to talk about today, including the potential for a tropical system to be forming in the southwestern Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean over the next 5 to 6 days, and a look at what to expect for the upcoming 2022 Atlantic hurricane season. Jumping straight into everything, taking a wide look across the tropical Atlantic this afternoon, we notice that not much is occurring for the time being. We do have a tropical wave that has now emerged off of South America. And we were talking about this tropical wave yesterday and the day previous, that this is a wave to watch as it begins to enter the Caribbean, which it has now done so. The axis of this wave is located somewhere right about here, coming now off the coast of South America, and it will continue to work its way generally off towards the west over the next several days, where development chances start to at least somewhat increase from there. Now, over the next 4 to 5 days, I don't really expect to see much development. There will be a lot of land interaction here, as this is expected to kind of plow right into Central America, but we'll talk about what to expect after that. We could even see some Eastern Pacific development. We're starting to notice an uptick in support here on the models for some Eastern Pacific development out of this as well. So officially from the National Hurricane Center, over the next 5 days, there is absolutely nothing to worry about. This goes through the end of the 5-day, 120-hour forecast cycle here from the Hurricane Center, so nothing to worry about officially yet. Again, I still wouldn't be surprised to see a little yellow X pop up somewhere within this vicinity over the next several days as just kind of a precautionary reason. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. Sea surface temperature wise, at least here, this is the actual sea surface temperatures. We notice that most of the Gulf of Mexico is primed and ready to go for early season activity. We notice we've had this very persistent warm eddy right here that has been lasting for the last several months. This warm eddy extends pretty far into the central and eastern Gulf of Mexico here. And what this really tells me is that, again, anything that might try to, pop its way through there might have the opportunity for some strengthening, all else being equal. And of course, down here in the Bay of Campeche and southwestern Gulf, water temperatures roughly on the order of about 28 to 29 Celsius, more than sufficient for early season activity. Now, the rest of the Gulf, including much of the far central and northeastern Gulf of Mexico here, still with water temperatures of 27 to 26 Celsius. So right on the kind of the border lines between what would be acceptable for tropical cyclone formation and maintenance. But this is definitely shelf water. Now, right here, this is not shelf water per se. This is deeper water. And water temperatures here are still roughly around 26.5 to 27 Celsius. So they definitely are still prominent, at least right now, for some tropical development and maintenance. But the bigger and warmer waters are down here in the Bay of Campeche, and then this warm eddy extending into the central and eastern Gulf of Mexico. And right up here around the Florida Big Bend, water temperatures are actually around 26 to less than about 26 Celsius. And this is indicative of the cooler and more shallower shelf waters, which are easily more mixed. And this would be unsupportive for tropical cyclone formation. But you could still get a tropical storm in that area that maintains itself. But looking ahead at what to expect for the next several days, and this is just one of the players that we look for in terms of tropical development. What we're looking at here is the Kelvin wave forecast. And again, we've been talking about Kelvin waves over the past several days. So to kind of give a brief summary and overview of what a Kelvin wave is, a Kelvin wave is really just a pocket of upward moving air or downward moving air. So rising air or sinking air in the atmosphere. And we quantify that in terms of the velocity potential anomalies here. And again, this is looking at the most of the Atlantic and portions of the Eastern Pacific as well. And we notice that we have a big upward branch here of rising air that is centered over the Eastern Pacific and South America at the moment. And this branch will continue to move eastward with time. Now, it usually takes around a day to 2, maybe 3 days at most until the atmosphere actually responds to this force in the atmosphere. It takes the atmosphere is a little bit delayed, and so it takes a little bit for the atmosphere to actually respond to this. And as such, again, we would expect to be seeing an increase in shower and thunderstorm activity naturally down here in this part of the world as the Kelvin wave passes through. Again, Kelvin waves too move a bit quicker than the slower Madden-Julian oscillations, which is the same exact version of a Kelvin wave, but bigger in spatial and temporally it's slower. So those are the differences there between the Madden-Julian oscillation and what is called a convectively coupled Kelvin wave. So if we actually look down here on the visible satellite in terms of our tropical wave, what are we necessarily seeing? Well, what we can tell right now is that, again, we have a broad disorganized area of shower and thunderstorm activity generally over this part of the world. Again, not really much to write home about at the moment. Now, what is to be expected by most of the models is that we'll be starting to see a slower trade wind belt through here. We've got westerly winds coming through here on the eastern Pacific side, and that's leading to a little bit of convergence over here on the eastern Pacific side, very close to Central America. And then in the Caribbean side, we've got these easterly trades here. So we can kind of see that there's a broad cyclonic flow that will begin to set up across this area over the next several days. And you can already kind of start to see, we're starting to see a little bit of that begin to kind of take shape. So that will be something to watch over the next several days. And a very key element is whether or not we get organized convection on this side of the world that begins to propagate over Central America and then lifts northward with time, and according to the GFS forms an area of low pressure down here somewhere closer to the Yucatan Peninsula. So speaking of the GFS, this is the GFS forecast. This is the 12Z run, valid for 8 p.m. this evening, 0Z. Again, this is kind of what we're watching, this very broad area of turning in the atmosphere down here, this little bit of cyclonic flow. And over the next several days, we notice that the GFS isn't really particularly thrilled. And again, the GFS has its own biases. Particularly, it has a history of producing fantasy hurricanes. It's gotten better at it over the past several years through various upgrades and different model integrations here. But this is just one of the very relevant things that we have to talk about within the overall package, which is the GFS forecast. And if we move forward in time, eventually we start to get what looks like a cyclone developing on the model. And that now then by May 24th, apparently, according to the GFS, lifts northward and closes in on the Yucatan Peninsula. The problem with that, though, is if we go back to several runs ago, we noticed that, again, several runs ago, the GFS already had a storm, and it's been pushing back development through time, which means that development odds are not necessarily increasing with time, they are decreasing with time. They're not moving up, they're being pushed back in the longer range. And this is one of the things that leads me to believe that this might actually be, even though it's very consistent, this might actually be one of those fantasy hurricanes that is developed within the model, but is not going to be the outcome in reality. And one of the things that we can do to look at that is the GFS ensembles. So we'll look at the GFS ensembles, and I want to take a look, first of all, at the ensemble mean sea level pressure. So this is the GFS ensembles, again, 12Z run. Now we notice at day 5 here, I mean, there is a relatively decent, strong signal here at day 5 on the GFS ensembles that we have an area of low pressure somewhere near the Yucatan Peninsula and Central America. Whether this is a tropical depression storm, hurricane, or none of the above, that is not what we're getting at here. What we're getting at is that there's just a broad area of low pressure somewhere down in the Yucatan Peninsula. However, this is the tricky part. Because we're going to have a Central American gyre that is setting up, that basically just means we have a large area of broad cyclonic rotation in Central America. very notorious for spitting up early and late season tropical systems, and notorious for producing copious rainfall in Central America. Produces very deadly mudslides, flash flooding, etc. But the Central American gyre as a whole, it's an area of low pressure. So this doesn't necessarily tell us much. And if we look at some of these members here, we notice that there's a clustering of members here that are in the 1010 Millibar range, which is very weak. And then there's some on the order of 990, 998, 996. I think there's 87 in there. It's 987. So you get the idea that there's a clustering of members suggesting areas of low pressure and then what would be supposedly a tropical entity somewhere within there. Now, let's look at the 200 millibar wind pattern though. This tells a very different story. And this is what you have to look at when forecasting whether or not we could see any development or not. And this is looking at the 200 millibar wind pattern at about the cruising line or cruising altitude of airlines, so about 30 to 39,000 feet above the ground here. And what we notice is we've been talking about over the last several days, there will be an upper level anticyclone, basically an area of high pressure aloft which reduces shear at the surface and would allow for tropical development. But there's a problem with that. You notice where it is, it's over Central America. And that's not really good because you see what the wind does here closer to the Yucatan Peninsula. Not only does it go from light shear, 10 to 15 knots, you now have about 20, 30, 40 knots, especially in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's just an abundance of shear, which you won't get a system to develop in that. And furthermore, the importance here is that with a displaced upper level anticyclone, you're going to get natural generating shear as a result of that displacement. And while that's not necessarily enough to completely squash development, it is enough to say that any non-organized entity that isn't already there is going to have a really rough time developing. And that doesn't really change. I mean, there's an abundance of shear throughout this entire time, all the way out to the end of the run on June 2nd. There's just an abundance of shear. Now, there still is this overall gyre that's around here, the cyclonic flow, but it's mainly over Central America. And at this point, it doesn't really go to suggest that we'll be seeing any sort of tropical entity developing down there anytime soon. And one of the other problems here, the 500 millibar height anomalies at day 5, again, this is another key thing. We have a ridge of high pressure that is kind of stretched across here in the upper levels, and this is one of the things that, while it will be weakening with time, this isn't necessarily something that's just going to start pulling something northward. And in fact, here at the 850 level, if we can look there, the 850 millibar height anomalies, we're going to have this big old ridge of high pressure out here. And that's mainly driving the overall air mass just straight into Central America. And so this doesn't really go to suggest that we'll be seeing anything significant. Now, we can go to the European ensembles and look at much of the same thing. So we'll take a look at the European ensembles. Again, the 200 millibar wind here. And the European ensembles just are not overly conducive at all. And in fact, here by the hour 180, which is where this thing runs out through so far, I mean, you're blasting with 50 knots of shear here in the Caribbean or in the southwestern Gulf of Mexico. And that's not really conducive at all. And the ensemble mean sea level pressures at this time aren't really conducive either. A few members here trying to show up, maybe a small hint at low pressure down here, and maybe another one out here in the Eastern Pacific. So there's kind of two areas to really watch here. But overall, this really is not going to be that much of a game changer. And this big old ridge that's out here, again, isn't really budging according to the Europeans. So not really so sure that we're going to get tropical development. I mean, is it theoretically possible? Absolutely. Maybe worth a mention at some point from the hurricane center. But notice where we're at through right now, through at least the 5-day period. Big old ridge of high pressure, and that ridge ain't going anywhere. So it looks like for the time being that tropical development is going to be shut down. Now, 7-day precip anomalies again. We are going to be seeing consistent above normal rainfall in this area as a result. So this doesn't really matter anyway for folks in Central America, whether or not this is a named storm or not. There will certainly be some consequences as a result of this, including the threat for dangerous mudslides, flash flooding, and severe weather as well. So unfortunately for folks down there, this isn't really going to help at all, regardless of whether this even becomes a depression or not. But for folks up here that are worrying in the Gulf of Mexico, Florida, etc., there's nothing to worry about right now. And honestly, long range forecasting, especially in the GFS with these early season activities, can be very tricky. And anything with a Central American gyre is very tricky, but you're also adding time, spatial time into this, temporal and spatial time. So just very hard to determine what could happen, but I'm not so sold on the GFS idea of any major system ending up in the Gulf within the next week or so. All right. So that being said, this is going to conclude the hurricane outlook and discussion. Remember, my basically all of my stuff will be out tomorrow. The e-course will be out tomorrow. The hurricane preparedness e-course, that will all be out tomorrow. And that will be announced when I do my video. First thing when I do my video tomorrow around 4 p.m. as well. All right. So with that being said, I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon evening. Of course, I am Michael Romali, and I'll talk to you guys again some more tomorrow.